When the current wave of VR started happening, and we're trying all the demos are very simple, right? It's just you're in a house, whoa, look at this house that I'm in right now, or like you're in space, or you're underwater. And I was like, this is really cool. This is kind of what this new medium is about. It's about more experiential, kind of contemplative experiences. And then immediately I was like, yeah, but how do you make an arcade game? How do you make something like score-driven that is like a classic video game? Because I thought, that's harder. Like, how do you make a game that will make you come back to it, that will be addictive, that you'll want to get good at, that has like a skill to it? And we had this thing that existed for years, SuperHyperCube, and it would just immediately click like, oh, this is what we should do. Let's start working.
It's so cliche to say that you have to be in it in order to feel what it's really like. You know, it's virtual reality if virtual reality was invented in like the 70s or the early 80s.
We're a collective in a sense of an art collective, so KOKOROMI making something expressly to be commercializable is a very unusual move for us.
It's very hard to describe this game. In one sense, you can describe the gameplay. The two kind of, I think, key points that tend to work with people overall is this relationship of it to that Japanese game show Hole in the Wall in terms of the gameplay.
The core concept of the game is that you have to match the shape to the hole, but you can't see the hole because the shape is right in front of you.
You're basically in like a virtual cockpit that's just always going forward, and then we're tracking your head so you can move around in 3D space.
It all was part of a whole, the head tracking, the stereoscopy. It's just this incredibly unusual visual effect that you don't expect.
When I was 10 years old, I went to Disneyland, and at Disneyland they had one of those early VR cabinets. And I played Dactyl Nightmare, which is a well-known early VR game where two people are in this first-person 3D environment and you can shoot at each other. It's like basic deathmatch. And also there's a pterodactyl in the sky and it swoops down and kills you sometimes. It's really weird. And I was blown away because I was always into sci-fi and all that kind of stuff as a kid. And I was like, here it is. Just a few more years and it's gonna be perfect. I can't wait for this thing to really materialize and like have one at home. And then that fizzled out and never happened, but it almost has a nostalgic quality. And finally it's real, you know, it actually works and it's good. It is science fiction. It's as close to like complete reality substitution as we have right now, and it's exciting for me. Video games is always what I wanted to do my whole life. There was no doubt that that was the job I wanted. I started at Ubisoft in Montreal and was very quickly delusionized. Is that the word? Yeah. I saw how the hot dog gets made, basically, and it was hard to stomach. Like my lifelong dream of working at a studio very quickly became like, oh, it's just kind of a sweatshop. And at the time, like the music scene in Montreal was like super vibrant. Like all this stuff was happening and like just amazing shows and parties everywhere all the time. And it was like, why is there nothing like that in video games? Like there's nobody getting together after hours to make cool shit, you know, outside of the office. And we realized that there was just this hole that needed to be filled. So we started organizing the Gamma events to kind of fulfill that position. It was a little bit like a game jam where we would issue a theme and a challenge that would be built around some kind of technical limitation. And the third year, the challenge was design a game that uses anaglyphic, red-blue, stereoscopic glasses. Somehow designed meaningfully around that. Like, can you make something that requires stereoscopy to make sense? And we found that it's very difficult to design for stereoscopy in a way that is meaningful. So we cheated a little bit and we added the concept of head tracking to stereoscopy with these things. Based on the Johnny Lee Wiimote hack, it was this guy who created like a really lo-fi way of doing head tracking using a Wiimote. And by doing that, it creates like this kind of magic mirror effect into the screen where as you move your head, the perspective in the game adjusts itself to match your position and it just looks like a hologram. And that created like a depth effect. It was really convincing and it was basically VR without VR. But the game itself didn't have any colors because that red-blue stereoscopy will be more effective if it's against gray colors.
We were so limited in terms of what it could actually look like. It ends up taking this very almost stark brutalist. It looks like something like from a Soviet satellite that's been rescued, that you somehow have kind of remediated into a game. There's something really beautifully ugly about it, actually.
The HyperCube was a little side project. You know, we only had 2 or 3 months to develop it before the event. And then after the event, we didn't keep working on it. Like, we showed it at parties, but it was always that same version. And that version just lay dormant for a number of years until the Oculus Rift first came out, the first version, which didn't do head tracking. The Oculus DK1 only had like the gyroscopes. It didn't track your movement at all. And that's when we started talking to Sony. We got in touch with them. It was like, yours does head tracking, right? And it's like, yeah, no problem. And then we started developing that version in earnest. Like, okay, now we have the hardware works. Technology has finally caught up to our original idea. We've got all the pieces. Let's start working. It was a fairly organic process where like it took us a while to kind of settle into roles just because we needed to. Like, we all have our different areas of expertise because like, oh, well, if it's a code or a music thing, Damien's gonna do it. And then Heather and Cindy fell into kind of more producer, managerial kind of roles.
For this version that we're putting out on PlayStation, I did all the sound design for the game. There isn't really music per se. Like, the game itself has a rhythm to it. And so to have just canned music going that has its own tempo, that has its own rhythm, doesn't make sense. Like, it clashes with the actual rhythm of the gameplay.
The other thing about the current VR technology is that we're not limited to the anaglyphic 3D anymore. So it opened up what the environment could look and feel like, which for me was the most important thing about bringing it into VR in the first place.
It comes back to what I was saying earlier, in that VR has a certain nostalgic aspect for me. It's kind of retro-futuristic almost by nature. And then very quickly the idea became, what if VR was like a viable technology in the late 70s, early 80s? Like the computer interfaces in old movies, when you see like the targeting computer in Star Wars or the neon streets of Blade Runner, that kind of grain and warmth.
Most of that design was a collaborative process. We had images that we brought forward. So in particular, my one that I was always championing, because it's so ridiculous, is Xanadu. Xanadu was my one where I was like, yes, this game looks like this really terrible roller skating movie from the late 80s. This feels like it's the right sort of direction to be in. Also, the various levels that draw upon James Turrell's work has always been my favorite part of the game. And just having a VR environment where it felt perceptually different, like it felt like I was completely and utterly in an alien space. That just seemed way more interesting to me than trying to kind of recreate an actual space. And that's what we got with this one that we could not get with the other technologies. I'm a little bit concerned about this reemergence of VR in terms of its like long-term viability. It's, I think, an uphill battle to show people what you can actually do with the technology. People aren't sure why they would want it yet. And that maybe VR's time will be the next time it comes around, when it's a little bit cheaper, when it's a little bit more accessible for people overall.
I think the PSVR has a real shot of being the one device that kind of democratizes the idea of VR to the masses. The same way that, you know, iPhones, when iPhones first came out, people were like, what's the point? Like, I just need to make calls and send text. Why would I need a portable computer in there? And now it's like, well, you know, everybody has an iPhone. I'm hoping that VR becomes that ubiquitous. Like, VR is not a new console for video games. It's not a new platform. It's just a new interface. And you will be able to apply anything to that interface.
So 6, 7 years in the making. I think it just occurred to me that we're done the game. Like, we officially pressed the button a few days ago, but now it feels like it's actually really out there. It's fantastic.
It doesn't feel like anything. I know the game is coming out in like 2 weeks, but it hasn't clicked yet.
I hope the game does really well, but I'm more happy that it's out there than I am hoping that it, for example, does extraordinarily well financially. I like that it exists and that it can give people ideas of different things that they can do with VR. That is more meaningful to me than I think anything else in working on this.
It's so exciting to think we're one of the very first titles ever to come out for this new kind of video game. Like, that's thrilling.